Napa. I will not speak much because our colleague from JIGME, Dr. Dichen are here. They were the individuals who started working on this. First Napa submitted way back in 2006. Now, one interesting area that I would like to point in this Napa, one of the objectives was to identify synergy among multilateral agreements in conventions. But apparently, when you did a lot of consultation among the stakeholders, the projects went more towards a sectoral approach. We did very well in identifying urgent and immediate need of the farmers. So therefore, we had a number of projects that we implemented, NAPA 1, NAPA 2, and NAPA 3. NAPA 3 is under implementation. NAPA 2, I was one of the co-chair during that period of time. The interesting point with NAPA 2 was they addressed around 6 sectors. So it was more of a sectoral approach, except for, I would say, Tarayana Foundation. They worked very closely with the communities in terms of managing the water resources. And there was something lesson that you could share with others. Others were very specific to their own sectors. And these projects were implemented in partnership with UNDP, and funds were secured for UNDPC, LDCF. Now, in 2012, again, the NEC updated the NAPA. And one of the new project that came up was this environmental friendly road. Now, donors, implementing partners would encourage us to do a stakeholder consultation. Now, with the consultation, they will come up with this kind of a proposal. But this is not necessarily in line with the JEF and GCF financial mechanism. I know from the experience that we submitted 2 projects to GCF, Bhutan for Life. The other was on agriculture. In agriculture, there was a component on restoration of some farm roads, and there were some challenges or hitches in this respect. Now, I want to slightly touch also on our NDCs. And we were the first few countries really submitted the initial, and this is our second. And yesterday, there was a talk that in some presentations, they wanted to lock up the politicians in room and in a room full of carbon dioxide or something. But I thought in Bhutan, we will not lock up them, but we will take to those glacial sites. Because our politicians are very quick, fast in rectification. For instance, this Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. In 2016, we were able to rectify at one sitting by our parliaments. And 2017, I think we submitted our Paris Agreement. Now, in this NDC, we are encouraged to provide very ambitious targets. That was the requirement. But if you go by the Article 4.1, you want to reach net zero emission by 2015. For these reasons, many countries are saying that they will be carbon neutral by 2050, 2060. That is their commitment. But in Bhutan, we are already carbon negative. And yesterday you have heard that 70% of our forests sequestering some 6 million tons of carbon. But for your information, we have not included the carbon content of arable land, the carbon content of the shrubs, rangelands, meadows. So we have a huge still stock that if you assess, that will be more sequestration that we will be hearing down the line when we do. Now, interestingly, in our NDC, second NDC, you must have read, we have set some targets, mitigation targets. And I'm just questioning, if you are a carbon negative, and if you do not know your own emission from agriculture sector, is it really fair to set targets like 5% reduction? in synthetic fertilizer use, 200 hectares of reducing flooding. Because we really do not know of our own emission. So before going into that, I wrote an article last October about the emission from our greenhouse gas from agriculture sector. Although this morning, some of the presenters said agriculture is one of the most polluting sector. When in our case, I doubt actually. And I have argued why actually ours should be negligible in terms of emission, particularly methane and nitrous oxide. Now, to combat climate change looking ahead, I thought I will just focus on two areas. One is on the science part, the other is on the governance, which is science is something that in the long term, as well as immediately we can act on that. Now, in terms of the science part, way back in 2010, we did this snowmap track, and along the path, we did study soil and biodiversity across this snowman track, and around 14 plots we have established with the GPS coordinates. So if you are interested, as we move forward, the impact of warming on high altitude soils and biodiversity, this is a perfect place to visit. You have the baseline that we have established way back in 2010. And you can download this document. I have given that site. Now, if you're really keen to look into the past climate at that high altitude, I thought the best place is to go to base of Chumulhari from Paro. From Changotang, if you go up, if you look at, that is the first kind of a basin or grass pond that you will see. As you move forward, you might see another, sand and water coming down. Now, if you go further, you have some sort of a glacial lake. And these are like some sort of basins that you can go, one after another. And when you reach to the end, it's no more actually there as glaciation taking place, is a lake. So if you dig a core in each of those basins, there's a possibility that you will figure out what was like it at that point of time. So that is one possible area that in future research you can explore. And when you look at the vulnerability in our context, mountainous country, highly vulnerable to impacts of climate change, time and again you hear that. But one thing I thought probably it's high time we should do is really, identify or map those highly vulnerable villages. Because you see in some settlements, there are already signs of land degradation, and that will be compounded when there is a heavy monsoon or shift in the monsoon rainfall pattern. That is one. Now, this is I was talking about it. It's high time we also establish our own greenhouse emission gas from our agriculture sector. And unlike developed countries, our farming is quite specific. It's all on mostly on the sloping land, and we do a lot of agroforestry. We bring back a lot of organic matters to the soil, and fairly it is stable system that we have observed. And if you see that extreme, there's ridges. This is where we introduce these hedgerows along those sloping lands, just to have that reduce or minimize the erosion from those dry land when there is a heavy rainfall. So if you are interested, as I said, I have one article that I wrote in the national newspaper. It's there on that, why actually I believe that emission from our agriculture sector is minimal. The reason I argued was for the methane and as well as the nitrous oxide to emit from our agriculture sector, you need microbes, which needs a conducive environment. And if you do not have that conducive environment or right temperature, I doubt whether you can actually have that gas coming out. That is one. And secondly, if you really look at the amount of fertilizers that we use compared to global over 190 kgs per hectare, here we hardly use even 15, 20. So it's so minimal. So it's difficult to have some sort of a default, accept some sort of a default figure when you don't have actual data. Is it stuck? Or I've been speaking too long? Another area I want to really touch on this adaptation and climate change looking at is the watershed. Now, I think you must have heard all these 4 big rivers or heard about it. We have in the east, Kurichu, that I think you must have really crossed through. Come by, you have the Punachanchu, and as you move here, you have this Wanchu, then you have the, I'm sure this is Amochu. Anyway, these 4 rivers, you see, when it reaches its nick point, I mean, there's a geological dip, then it really moves fast. And therefore, by then, it's no more in use by our settlements, which are all settled around the hill slopes. So best probably use this water for hydropower. There is no way that you can really utilize for our communities. The best is to focus on those local watersheds that supplies your drinking and irrigation. And according to the assessment done by the Forest Department in 2010 and 2020 report, I mean around 149 watersheds are degraded. And that's, for me, that's scary actually. Because many of our communities, they depend on those watersheds as you move down to the south. They cannot use this, those big rivers. Is it okay? Now on the good governance part, I thought during 90s, when we were working on some projects, we used to have this kind of pre-financing provisions for some activities. I thought at this point of time, this is really something that we need to bring it back. Because, for example, at the local site, when you have the impacts of this climate on our road, on our irrigation channels, on river banks, if you do not act immediately that season, it will compound when next year comes. And in many cases, I have seen that when you go and visit the farms, the irrigation channel is washed out, and then there is no money or provision to support that, then farmer loses a 1-year season. And that is quite a serious matter for a small farmer. And I would also say that we have a lot of experience of working on the global projects with different partners. And if you see GCF, Jeff, project cycle, that is quite a heavy task on our small country like Bhutan to engage so much. But it is not because the Secretariat did that. It is we, the parties, guided that kind of a complex, formulation process. So, which means in our own context, we do not communicate or talk much about when they go and participate in conferences or JEF councils or GF's board. So this is critical for us to moving forward to have a very coordinated communication among the focal agencies of UN conventions and financial mechanisms. I mean, this will help us a lot in terms of putting project together or implementing a project. And finally, I have this point. I believe the debates will continue on climate change. Science will continue. Conventions will continue. But we cannot wait for that decision to act. For us, it is very important to really pursue education and advocacy. That is important, regardless of where you are. For example, if you go to Lunana or Laya to talk to any of those farmers, I would say that they will be more informed and aware of the climate change impact on their local sites than anyone living in Thimphu or any other country. And I believe that probably the Napa one, the lowering of this water during those projects, most of the workers are from that community. And this is where they have learned. It's not been reported or measured, but I have a firm belief that this is from where they have picked up about the ideas. That is one. And secondly, I would say that coordination would be key among the stakeholders, institutes, and particularly Bhutan graduating from LDC group. I think we have to maximize the co-benefits, minimize this, minimize the trade-offs from our climate investment. We don't have much money, so we must make best use of the money that we have at hand. So thank you for your attention.